First off, I'd like to say that, as y'all guys know, I try not to discuss my siblings' personal business. I need to stand up and say something, and that time is now.
Not every scar is visible. When Bear Brown opened up about the 5 people who left the deepest marks on his life, it wasn't about stirring the pot. It was about finally facing the pain head-on. What followed wasn't just a reveal, but a release. Here's what it really meant, and how it's changed the man behind the wild energy fans thought they knew. Matt Brown, the betrayal that started it all. Before Bear Brown ever led a camera crew through the Alaskan brush or built a makeshift shelter in the rain, there was someone else who walked those paths before him, Matt Brown. As the oldest of the Brown siblings, Matt had always been a guiding figure, the brother Bear once admired, trusted, and followed. In those early days, their bond seemed unbreakable. If Bear was the fire, Matt was the anchor. But time, as it often does, proved that not all family ties survive unscarred. Behind the scenes, Matt had been battling something Bear couldn't see at first: addiction. The cameras didn't capture every moment, but Bear felt the distance growing. In 2016, Matt entered rehab for alcohol abuse. It wasn't the first time the family had seen signs, but it was the first time the public did. At that point, Bear still believed his brother could come back stronger. That belief would be tested again just 2 years later when Matt checked into rehab for a second time. This time, not in Alaska or even Washington, but in California, alone. When the family relocated to Washington for Amy's cancer treatment in 2018, Matt didn't join them. Instead, he stayed behind in Los Angeles. At the time, Bear didn't say much about it, but those close to the situation say it left a mark. It wasn't just physical distance, one source said. It was emotional. Bear didn't know where his brother had gone, in more ways than one. Then, in 2021, the silence shattered. Matt took to social media with a string of explosive claims, accusing their father Billy of withholding earnings from Alaskan bush people and controlling the family's finances in a way that left Matt cold, broke, and resentful. He said he had worked for years without ever receiving his fair share of the money. To fans, it was shocking. To Bear, it was a betrayal. Bear had spent years defending the image of his father, a man who built their world from the ground up, literally. Whether or not the claims were true, Bear saw the timing and the delivery as unforgivable. Billy had passed away in early 2021, and Matt waited until his voice could no longer answer back to make those accusations. To Bear, that was crossing a line. But things didn't stop with money. Later that same year, 2 women, Jessica and Shelley, came forward with disturbing allegations against Matt. Both claimed he had sexually assaulted them while under the influence in the summer of 2019. They were not strangers. They had worked with Matt, helped him through addiction, and trusted him. Bear never commented directly on the claims. He didn't need to. He didn't appear on social media during the storm, didn't mention Matt by name on the show. What he did do, quietly but deliberately, was remove himself. From then on, Bear distanced himself from any conversation involving Matt. In a rare live stream in 2022, when a fan asked if Matt would be returning to Alaskan bush people, Bear gave a short answer: "No, he's doing his own thing. We don't really talk anymore." It was said without anger, but also without any sign of reconciliation. Matt's disappearance from the family wasn't just a personal loss to Bear, it was the first real fracture in the wolf pack narrative. For Bear, whose identity was so tightly tied to family, it was painful to realize that the pack could, and did, fall apart. Even years later, Bear hasn't called Matt an enemy, but he has called what happened a wound that never healed right. In the wilderness, Bear knew how to fix broken things: a torn tarp, a snapped branch, a collapsed shelter. Those could all be patched up with enough time and effort, but when trust is what breaks, there's no simple repair. For Bear, Matt wasn't just a brother. He was a symbol of something Bear believed would never shatter: family unity. And when that was lost, it shook everything else loose. People change, Bear once said cryptically during a fan Q&A. And sometimes, they're not who you thought they were. Or maybe, they were never that person at all. Matt Brown may have been the first to walk away, but for Bear, he was also the first person who made him question whether the family he'd risked everything for would ever be the same again. Raven Adams, love, loss, and the public fallout. If Matt Brown was the brother who broke Bear's trust, then Raven Adams was the woman who broke his heart, not once, but repeatedly, and all under the unforgiving spotlight of the public eye. From the moment Bear Brown and Raven Adams made their relationship official, it was anything but ordinary. Fans of Alaskan bush people first heard about Raven in 2019, when Bear posted cryptic photos and captions suggesting a new chapter in his life. The outdoorsman who lived for danger, nature, and raw survival was suddenly writing poems and posting selfies with hearts. For a brief moment, it seemed like Bear had found balance in a world that rarely allowed him peace. But the peace didn't last. The relationship between Bear and Raven was passionate, fast-moving, and deeply unstable. They got engaged, then broke up. Then they reconciled, then broke up again. By 2020, it was hard for even die-hard fans to keep track of their status. And just when it seemed like things were permanently off, the couple announced that Raven was pregnant. Their son, River Anthony Brown, was born in March 2020, and that's when things went from complicated to chaotic. Bear initially denied paternity. It shocked fans. For someone who spoke so often about the importance of family and loyalty, Bear's hesitation seemed out of character. But he claimed he needed proof, a DNA test, before he could commit to fatherhood. It wasn't just about the science, it was about trust. And that trust, he felt, had been broken somewhere along the way. Raven, on the other hand, didn't hold back. She accused Bear of emotional abuse, claiming he had been unstable and aggressive during their relationship. The arguments spilled onto Instagram, into tabloids, and eventually into court. Raven filed for sole custody. Bear filed for joint. Court documents painted an ugly picture. Allegations of toxic behavior, mistrust, and emotional instability on both sides. For a man who had spent his life trying to protect the people he loved, Bear suddenly found himself fighting one of them in court. Eventually, Bear did confirm paternity and began visiting River. They tried once again to reconcile, and in 2022, in a surprising twist, they got married. Fans were hopeful. Maybe the storm had passed. Maybe, just maybe, Bear had found a way to rebuild what had been broken. But by 2023, it was all unraveling again. Raven accused Bear of domestic violence. He was arrested, and though the charges were later dropped, the damage was done. Bear, who had always prided himself on being protective, was now being painted as the threat. In response, he remained mostly silent publicly, offering only brief social media statements about working on himself and focusing on being a father. But behind the scenes, those close to him say he was devastated. This wasn't just a relationship that ended badly. It was a war that played out in front of millions. Bear had always worn his emotions on his sleeve. That's part of what made him so beloved. He wasn't afraid to cry on camera, to hug his mother tightly, to shout into the wind when he needed to feel alive. But with Raven, those emotions became a double-edged sword. Every reconciliation felt like hope. Every breakup felt like a betrayal. And the fallout wasn't just between them. It impacted his standing with fans, producers, and even some family members. The man who had always been portrayed as wild but loyal suddenly looked unstable to many watching. Yet perhaps what hurt Bear the most wasn't the legal battles, or the media coverage, or the accusations. It was the realization that he had trusted someone so deeply with his heart, his future, and his child, and it still wasn't enough. He once described Raven as the light in a dark time, especially after the death of his father. But that light, he now admits, came with shadows he wasn't ready to face. "I've made mistakes," Bear wrote on Instagram in 2023, "but loving my son has never been one of them." Today, Bear's relationship with Raven is described as cordial at best. They co-parent River from a distance. The romantic chapter is closed, but the wounds are still healing. In private moments, Bear has acknowledged that he didn't handle everything perfectly, but he also believes that love, true love, shouldn't leave you feeling like you're drowning. Of the 5 people Bear says left the deepest scars on his life, Raven Adams makes the list not because he hated her, but because he once loved her more than anyone else. And when that kind of love falls apart, what's left behind doesn't always make sense. It just hurts. Joshua Bam Bam Brown, the unspoken rivalry. If Bear Brown ever had a natural rival within the family, it wasn't Matt. It was Joshua, better known as Bam Bam. The second eldest of the Brown siblings, Bam had always walked his own line. Quieter, more reserved, but with a quiet authority that Bear never quite learned to accept. On Alaskan Bush People, the camera painted Bear as the high-energy, unpredictable brother, the one who climbed trees barefoot, howled at the sky, and did backflips in the mud. Bam, in contrast, was the responsible one, the thinker, the man who rarely raised his voice but always got his point across. They were complete opposites, and for a while, that worked. Every family needs balance, but the balance began to tilt once the show gained traction. As episodes aired and millions of viewers started forming opinions, the differences between Bear and Bam became harder to ignore, not just for fans, but for the brothers themselves. Bam didn't love the fame. While Bear leaned into the spotlight, Bam started pulling away. By 2017, he made headlines for stepping back from the show entirely, choosing instead to spend time with his then-girlfriend, Alaskan, a former producer on the series. The relationship alone stirred quiet tension, not because Bear had anything personal against Alaskan, but because it felt like Bam had chosen a different life, one that didn't involve the rest of the family. Behind closed doors, Bear saw it as a kind of betrayal, not in the obvious dramatic sense, but in the quiet, slow, passive kind that changes relationships forever. To Bear, it seemed like Bam was constantly measuring him. He felt judged, dismissed, like the things that made him Bear. His impulsive spirit, his wildness, his loud love were just distractions to Bam, who preferred order and control. The friction only worsened after their father Billy's death in 2021. The family was shaken, broken in ways that no survival training could fix. They tried to hold together, but grief has a way of magnifying old wounds. Bear, who had always been close to Billy, struggled to find his footing without him. Bam, on the other hand, seemed to retreat further into isolation. At one point, Bear confided to a friend that Bam hadn't called him for months after their father's passing. Not once, he said, not even a message to ask how I was holding up. Whether that was by accident or choice, it was a wound that cut deep. The divide between the brothers grew as decisions had to be made about the show, the family land, and the direction of their brand. Bam took more interest in the practical aspects: financing, business, public relations. Bear wanted to honor his dad by continuing the legacy, but not in the way Bam envisioned. Eventually, small disagreements turned into bigger ones over what to film, what not to film, how their story should be told, and how much of it was even still true. To the public, there was no outburst, no televised feud. But behind the scenes, Bear started to distance himself. He began appearing solo more often, and when he talked about family, his tone was different, hesitant, guarded. In a rare social media Q&A in 2022, a fan asked Bear about Bam. His response was short: "We don't talk as much as we used to. Different paths, I guess. Different paths." That's all Bear would say, but those close to him say there's more. A deep frustration that he can't quite express. He once admitted that Bam made him feel small, like nothing I do is ever smart enough, serious enough, adult enough. And maybe that's the core of it. For years, Bear fought to prove that his wild spirit didn't make him foolish, that his emotions weren't weaknesses, that he could be just as strong, just as steady as anyone else. But with Bam, that never seemed to land. It's not hatred, not really. Bear doesn't talk about Bam with anger. He talks about him with sadness, like an old friend who moved away and never wrote back, like a brother who stood beside him on camera but never quite saw him off it. Of the 5 people Bear says hurt him most, Bam Bam makes the list not because of a single betrayal, but because of a slow erosion, the kind that sneaks up on you and one day just feels like distance. And for a family that once claimed nothing could ever pull them apart, that silence says more than any fight ever could. The Discovery Channel producer, the puppet master behind the curtain. For years, fans believed the Brown family was calling the shots on Alaskan bush people. The image was simple: a tight-knit family surviving off the land, making their own choices, and living by their own rules. But if you ask Bear Brown today, that wasn't always the case. And one of the people who made his hate list didn't share a last name with him, but had just as much power over his life: a former Discovery Channel producer. Bear has never outright named this person publicly, but he's hinted at them enough that anyone paying close attention could put the pieces together. According to Bear, the tension didn't begin at the start. In fact, early on, the producer was seen as a friend of the family, someone who understood their story and promised to tell it authentically, someone who, in Bear's words, got it. But television has a way of changing people, and eventually, the desire for ratings began to outweigh the respect for reality. Behind the scenes, Bear said he started noticing shifts in how stories were told. Scenes were rearranged, dialogue was edited, certain moments, the raw, human ones, were left on the cutting room floor, while arguments and dramatic footage were given front-row seats. Bear, the most high energy of the Brown kids, quickly became a character, not a person. A character, the wild one, the feral wolf, the guy who climbed trees and growled at the camera. It made for great TV, but it didn't always reflect the truth. He tried to speak up. More than once, Bear asked that certain things be cut, or that more of his serious moments be included. But over time, those requests were ignored. According to sources close to the family, this producer would often brush off Bear's concerns with lines like, "You're great for TV. Just trust the process," or "This is what the fans want to see." But Bear didn't feel seen. He felt used, and when his father Billy passed away, the divide deepened. The producer allegedly insisted on filming scenes just days after the loss. Bear reportedly refused, telling him flat out that grief wasn't a storyline. It was real, it was raw, and it didn't belong in a script. According to Bear, that was the moment everything changed. He realized the show was no longer theirs. It belonged to someone else, and he was tired of being cast as the wild card while his family fell apart behind the scenes. In one emotional live stream, Bear shared a moment from the aftermath of his father's death that never made it to air. He had sat by the river alone, talking out loud to Billy, breaking down for the first time in days. A cameraman had captured it, but the producer cut the footage. "Too quiet," he said, "not dramatic enough." That was the final straw. Bear stopped trusting the team. He became distant, difficult to direct, and started skipping shoot days entirely. The tension boiled over in 2022, when Bear reportedly refused to take part in several episodes unless certain edits were approved in advance. The producer pushed back. Bear walked. For fans, the change was subtle. Bear was still on screen, but less often. When he did appear, something felt different. He seemed more guarded, more aware of the lens. That's the part Bear resents most. Not the fame, not the strange looks at the grocery store, but the loss of control over his own story. To him, this producer didn't just make bad calls, they turned his life into a performance. And that, to Bear, was the ultimate betrayal. He once said in a now-deleted post, "We let someone into our lives, into our home, and they turned it into something we barely recognized. That's not family, that's manipulation." And that's why this producer made the list. Not because they yelled, not because they lied, but because they sat at the table, smiled at the Browns like they were part of the pack, and then sold their story to the highest bidder. For Bear, that kind of betrayal cuts deeper than most. Because when someone claims to be your friend and then treats you like a storyline, it leaves a scar that even time struggles to heal. Raven Adams, the love that turned into a storm. When it comes to Bear Brown, there's no name more emotionally charged than Raven Adams. She wasn't just a chapter in his life, she was a storm, a whirlwind of love, pain, passion, and heartbreak. And if you ask Bear today, this was the one relationship that cut deeper than any feud within the family. Because Raven wasn't just someone he loved, she was someone he trusted to help build a future. And that trust shattered in ways no one expected. Their relationship started fast. Too fast, some fans said. They met, fell in love, and announced their engagement all within a blink. It was a whirlwind romance that seemed to fit Bear's intense, all-or-nothing personality. For a while, it felt like a fairy tale. The wildest brown brother had finally found his partner, someone who could ground him while also embracing his untamed spirit. But the reality was far from simple. Almost immediately, cracks began to show. Just days after their first engagement, the couple called it off. Then, days after that, Raven announced she was pregnant. The back and forth became a pattern. Together one week, broken up the next. Engaged again, separated again, and all of it played out in real time across social media, where fans followed every post, every deleted photo, every cryptic caption. Bear, who had always worn his heart on his sleeve, took the chaos hard. According to those close to the family, he tried desperately to make it work, not just for himself, but for their son, River. He wanted to be the father he never had a chance to see in his own childhood. And at times, it seemed like Raven wanted that too. But trust had already begun to erode. Allegations were made, legal documents were filed, words that couldn't be taken back were spoken. In 2020, Bear and Raven entered a bitter custody battle. Raven filed for legal protection, citing concerns about Bear's behavior. She accused him of being erratic and emotionally volatile. Bear, in turn, denied the claims and fought back, insisting that he just wanted to be in his son's life. To outsiders, it looked like a messy breakup, but to Bear, it felt like betrayal. The woman he had planned a future with was now fighting him in court, questioning not only his love, but his right to be a father. He later shared online that he had felt powerless, describing it as a nightmare that didn't end when I woke up. Eventually, the legal battles cooled off. They tried to co-parent. There were brief moments of hope, a joint post here, a family photo there. For a short time, they even reunited and officially tied the knot in January 2022. Fans thought maybe the storm had passed. Maybe, just maybe, Bear had found peace. But peace didn't last. By March 2022, they had split again, this time for good. Raven confirmed it publicly, saying they were better off apart and asking for privacy. Bear, however, couldn't stay silent. He took to Instagram, once again sharing his pain with his followers. He hinted at feeling misled, manipulated, and ultimately left behind. What made this breakup so different wasn't just that it was public, it was that it left Bear more alone than ever. After everything with Matt, the issues with Noah, and the tensions with production, Bear had clung to Raven as his safe space. Losing that meant losing his last anchor, and it hurt. He once wrote, "When you give your all to someone and they turn away, it doesn't just break your heart, it changes it." Raven, for her part, has kept her distance. While she occasionally shares moments with their son online, she's largely stepped back from the spotlight. Some say it's for the best. Others believe the door between them will never fully close, because no matter how much has happened, River ties them together forever. But Bear hasn't forgotten, and in his quiet moments, the ones fans don't see, those memories still weigh on him. He's never used the word hate toward Raven, but if you ask him about pain, about disappointment, about regret, she's at the top of that list, because love, when it turns sour, can feel more like betrayal than anything else. And for someone like Bear, who doesn't hold back, that kind of heartbreak doesn't fade. It lingers, it teaches, and it hardens you. And that's why Raven Adams, the woman he once called his everything, became the sixth and final person to shape Bear Brown's story in a way he'll never forget. When someone finally opens up about the people who hurt them most, it's not just a list of names. It's a window into every wound they've carried quietly, every memory they've had to relive, and every time they've had to pick themselves up off the ground without anyone noticing. For Bear Brown, revealing the 5 people who left scars on his life wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of release. For years, Bear was known as the wild one, the adrenaline chaser, the loud laugh, the energy in the room when everyone else seemed too tired. Fans saw him jumping into snow, climbing trees, sprinting through the forest like a man who didn't know how to sit still. And maybe that was the point, because when you're constantly moving, it's harder for the pain to catch you. But it always does. Eventually, it does. Looking back at the names he mentioned, whether it was estranged family, distant siblings, or Raven, the woman who once held his entire heart, there's a pattern. It's not just that these people wronged him. It's that Bear trusted them deeply. He let them in. He believed they had his back the way he had theirs. And when that belief fell apart, it left him questioning everything. Let's be honest. Bear Brown has never tried to pretend he's perfect. He's made mistakes, big ones. He's lashed out. He's posted things he probably regretted. He's admitted to struggling with mental health, especially after his father Billy passed. He's acknowledged that his emotions often run high, that sometimes he reacts before thinking. But what sets him apart is this: he owns it. He never claims to be a saint. He only ever claimed to be someone who loved hard. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when others didn't love him the same way. With Matt, the pain was layered. They were brothers. They were once inseparable. And yet, Bear had to watch his oldest brother spiral, not just into addiction, but into isolation. It wasn't just that Matt hurt the family, it's that he refused to come back when they needed him most. And for Bear, watching someone he looked up to disappear without a goodbye left a hole that never really healed. With the others, the broken relationships, the betrayals behind the scenes, Bear started to realize something painful. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty. And sometimes, the people you grow up with become strangers. Or worse, they become people who see your pain and still choose to make it worse. But none of them shook him quite like Raven did. That relationship was a roller coaster, and every time Bear thought the ride was over, it threw him into another loop. From their whirlwind love to the custody battles, from their marriage to the sudden silence that followed, it was a reminder that even the deepest love can become a battlefield. And when a child is involved, it gets heavier. Bear didn't just lose a partner, he lost a version of his future he had once clung to with both hands. That's the part fans often don't see. The toll of being publicly heartbroken. The weight of trying to be a father while also trying to be okay. Bear has shared that he's still learning, still making mistakes, still figuring out how to be present when the past keeps pulling at him. But the difference is, now he's doing it on his terms. One thing Bear has made clear in recent years is that he's tired of pretending. Tired of pretending that everything is okay when it's not. Tired of staying quiet when people rewrite his story. Tired of smiling through betrayal because the cameras are rolling. That's why this list, the 5 people who impacted him the most in the worst ways, isn't just about them. It's about him reclaiming his voice. Each relationship taught Bear something different. From Matt, he learned that even family can abandon you. From others, he learned that not everyone who claps for you wants you to succeed. And from Raven, he learned that love isn't always enough to save something if it's broken from the inside. But he also learned this: he's still standing, and that matters. It matters because Bear has survived not just the wilderness, but emotional landmines most people wouldn't make it through. He's watched his family splinter. He's lost his father. He's faced online judgment. He's been pulled into courtrooms and dragged through tabloids. And yet, somehow, he still finds the strength to be a dad, to post messages of hope, to remind his fans to be kind, to keep believing. Because that's what Bear does. He keeps going. If you ask him today what hurts more, being hurt or not being believed, he'll probably say both. Because when you live your life under a microscope, every misstep becomes a headline. Every private fight becomes public. And the pressure to stay silent grows heavier with every rumor. But not anymore. This time, Bear's saying it out loud. Not to stir drama, not to drag people, but to breathe. Because sometimes healing isn't about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about acknowledgement. It's about saying, "This happened, it broke me, but I'm still here." And that's the part that matters most. Bear Brown isn't perfect. He's emotional. He's impulsive. He's human. But he's also honest. And in a world full of filters and fakery, that honesty stands out. So as we leave behind the 5 names that changed Bear's story, maybe the question isn't who hurt him. Maybe the question is, who is Bear becoming because of it? Because while the people he trusted may have walked away, Bear is still walking. And these days, he's doing it with his head held high.